Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's great to see a new audience, a refreshed audience, with some members from the morning as well, so thank you for returning. This afternoon, we have our second panel titled Trials, Temptations, Monsters, and Mythographies. Some of the predominant themes of the morning to do with empowerment, but mainly power, subversion, sex containment, and psychoanalysis, and race and gender will be all on the table for discussion. And we step back in time. We're beginning with the papers on the 16th century, and we'll be moving up from the 16th to the 17th into the 19th century and ending in the contemporary now. So welcome to our panel, and I'll start it off. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. My name is Dan Trunzo, and my thesis is entitled What Right Had Caesar to the Empery, Power, and the Individual in the Plays of Christopher Marlowe? Quickly before I dive in, I'd like to acknowledge a few people first that helped me with this thesis. First, I'd like to thank my major and thesis advisor, Professor Roland Green, for all of his advice and support throughout the entire process. I'd also like to thank my second reader, Professor Patricia Parker, as well. I'd also like to thank Professor Mark Algie Hewitt for providing the XML data for my analysis of the Jew of Malta in the second chapter. And I'd also like to thank my friends and family for their support throughout the entire process. Finally, I need to thank my PhD mentor, Juan, for all of his help. His advice and comments throughout the whole process really elevated the quality of my thesis and helped with some panache in the introduction as well. So let's dive right in. A little overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to do a quick briefing on Marlowe, talk about the thesis and the methodology that I took, talk about void theory in Dr. Faustus, network analysis in the Jew of Malta, and wrapping it up with why it all matters and the massacre at Paris. Now, my thesis is about characters from tragedies written by the man at the center of an ongoing murder mystery. Marlowe is a difficult figure to demystify. His life is the most spectacular of any English dramatist due to his meteoric rise on the theater scene in London and his abrupt death at the age of 29. His background as a working-class outsider, spy, and sodomite heightens the subject material of his plays. His provocative dramas fracture any conception of a holistic Elizabethan world perspective. During this time, individuals called witches or Jews through rumors meant they could be tortured and executed. There are numerous accounts of publicly attended executions, like the one of convicted witch Agnes Waterhouse in 1566. But Marlowe's protagonists embrace their dangerous status. Faustus takes up witchcraft and necromancy in the tragical history of Dr. Faustus, and Barabbas is a proud Jewish merchant in Jew of Malta. These two individuals allured audiences to their productions similar to the spectacle of witches and Jews' public executions. These dangerous figures are the protagonists of Christopher Marlowe's plays. I argue in my thesis that Marlowe's characters have a unique relationship to power. As pariahs from the conventional world, the subversion of Marlowe's protagonists is rooted in their construction. They fashion themselves not in the direct contrast to the orthodoxy of their worlds, as new historicist scholars have argued. Instead, they fashion themselves to the most radical ends of their ambitions. For Faustus, that ambition is gaining power through knowledge. And for Barabbas, that ambition is garnering as much wealth as possible. They fashion themselves in such a way that they have a total disregard for anything that does not help them achieve their objective. Their radical individualism is the source of their power and the catalyst for their tragic deaths. In my first chapter on Dr. Faustus, I take a classic approach to my thesis. I attempt to develop a theory of Faustus's empowerment and death. Since the 1980s, two modes of literary criticism have dominated discourse on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. First, there is American New Historicism. This group of scholars believes that texts are socially produced. The influences of dominant culture permeate texts, and scholars attempt to analyze dissent within these texts to better understand the era. In this way, they attempt to speak with the dead. Meanwhile, there is also the more Marxist British cultural materialism. This group of scholars believe that dissent and subversion are a necessary consequence of living in a dominant culture. And by looking at the past 40 years of work from these two modes of literary criticism and my own close readings of the text, my own theory of Faustus diverts from both camps. In my second chapter on the Jew of Malta, I take an innovative approach to analyzing power in the individual. With an XML data file of the text, I coded in the programming language R a script to map all the relationships in the play. Through this distant reading, as opposed to close reading in the first chapter, I demonstrated how Barabbas uses minor characters to achieve his ambitions. But once those characters develop their own ambitions, the networks begin to diminish as Barabbas murders, poisons, and kills all those that used to help him. Through the destruction of these spheres of minor characters, Barabbas loses all support on the island, and as a result, dies a very gruesome death. So let's hop into the first chapter. In my first chapter, I discussed Dr. Faustus. Faustus uses magic to summon the devil Mephistopheles. And using Mephistopheles as a messenger, Faustus strikes a deal with Lucifer. He is to be allotted 24 years of life on Earth, during which time he can use Mephistopheles as his personal servant and the ability to use magic. However, at the end of this time, he will give himself over to Lucifer as payment and spend the rest of his time damned in hell. In Dr. Faustus, the protagonist, Faustus, opens the play in his study cataloging the different figures of classical knowledge. He mentions Aristotle, Galen, Justinian the Great, and St. Jerome. In the world of Faustus, these men represent the definitive ends of areas of scholarship that they have influenced. When Faustus begins talking about Aristotle, he declares that he will level at the end of every art and live and die in the works of Aristotle. To Faustus, he will study each scholar, and by doing so, he will absorb the entirety of their knowledge. When I talk about classical knowledge being a dominant cultural force, what I mean is that it has the ability to consolidate power and impose its culture on those who subscribe to it. For example, Faustus as a scholar is particularly subject to the influence of classical knowledge, as it's the sole mode of learning for him and his fellow scholars. The opportunity to embrace necromancy or magic is due to Faustus recognizing something incredibly important about the cultural influences in his life. These scholars, Aristotle, Galen, Justinian the Great, and St. Jerome, are all predominant authorities for Faustus's learning world, but they are also very old scholars. As you can see, Aristotle's from the 4th century BC, Galen from the late 2nd century, Justinian and St. Jerome still before the first half of the first millennia. The works of these figures are highly residual for Faustus as a 15th century scholar. Their influence belongs to a previous culture, an earlier one. And as I propose in my thesis, when a cultural force, like the mode of classical learning, is the dominant cultural power, but also residual in its nature, it creates a void. Now, the void represents an opportunity to the individual that discovers it. Faustus recognizes that the cultural influences cannot provide him what he wants because of the duality of their nature. And so he turns to necromancy as his answer. Necromancy is neither a dominant nor residual force. There is no predominant authority in the scholarly world on necromancy. And by taking advantage of this opportunity, Faustus empowers himself to subvert other powers that he discovers in his life. For example, as a German resident, Faustus is a subject of the Duke, the Catholic Emperor of Germany, Charles V, and thereby the Pope. And so when Faustus goes to subvert these forces, he does so genuinely. Faustus genuinely subverts the Pope's dirge to condemn his soul, the threats of persecution by the Emperor of Germany, and the Duke of Anhalt. The only force that contains Faustus is himself. When Faustus commits to his resolute mind and the decision to embrace necromancy to its truest end, he eliminates his conscience, and removes all choice from the world. He is destined to only fashion himself to his ultimate objective, to know everything. And as a result, he cannot repent and is pulled into hell. Now, in my second chapter, I talk about the Jew of Malta. Jew of Malta is a tragedy about a wealthy, powerful merchant Jew, Barabbas, and his quarrel with the governor of the island, Farnese, when Farnese takes all of Barabbas's wealth. The essential problem of the play is a question of who has power and where it is acquired. In this chapter, I use network analysis to analyze the relationships between characters and how they empower each other and also threaten each other. So what you see on the screen here is a visual representation of every relationship in the play. Each axis here represents a character in the play, and a line from one axis going to another represents speech from this character, Barabbas at the center, to a character on another axis. The width or the weight of the line indicates the total number of words spoken. For example, we can see here, and I know it's hard to completely see it, but we see a sort of thicker line coming from here to this axis. This is Barabbas speaking quite often to his daughter, Abigail, and Abigail, in turn, speaking a fair amount less to her father. And when we see also lines going in and back out, going out and back in to an axis, that represents a soliloquy, Barabbas speaking to himself. So when we use this type of analysis, what we can do here is we have two representations of the relationships in Act 3. The one on the left includes Barabbas in the analysis, while the one on the right excludes any conversations that include Barabbas. So we've effectively removed him from the play. Now, up until Act 3, Abigail has functioned as an extension of Barabbas's will. As I mentioned in my thesis, she has an eigenvector and betweenness centrality of 0, which probably means very little. But this is actually extremely important because she has no ambition except to execute upon her father's commands. But after Ithamore, Barabbas's servant, reveals that her father has murdered her two love interests, Matthias and Lodwick, Abigail has a revelation. Previously, she was pretending to be a nun to enter her father's repossessed mansion, turned nunnery by the governor of Malta, in order to steal back her father's wealth for him. Now, in this moment, when Ithamore tells her this information, she fully rejects her father to become a faithful Christian nun after his evil doings. At this point, given her numerous conversations with clergy so far, Abigail has become a point character for a sphere of minor characters that we can see here, with Abigail centered here and the two friars here as well. She has a strong influence on the friars and the abbess, but now that she has become a threat to her father Barabbas, he must kill her. Barabbas poisons the offering basket at the nunnery and kills Abigail in the process. With no lead characters to direct Friar Iachimo and Barnardine, they are left without guidance. They are tricked by the friars are tricked by Barabbas, and Friar Barnardine is murdered, with Friar Iachimo hanged for the crime. Barabbas eliminating an entire sphere that once empowered him is a representation of minor characters switching from empowering to threatening. And as Barabbas eliminates every sphere of minor characters that had once empowered him, he is left without any support and faces a gruesome death as a result. Now, in my last moments, I want to talk about why this all matters. In Marlowe's plays, the characters embrace absolutism, a single way to live life. For Faustus, it is to learn as much as possible, and for Barabbas, it is to gain as much wealth as possible. Now, in the play Massacre at Paris, Marlowe stages the events leading up to and the resolution of the deadly St. Bartholomew Day's massacre in 1572, as painted here. It is an extremely contemporary event for Marlowe. The backdrop of the massacre was the royal wedding between the Catholic sister of the French king, Marguerite de Valois, and the Protestant Bourbon prince, Henry IV of Navarre. Now, the marriage was between Catholic and Protestant. A few days after the wedding, the greatest explosion of popular violence yet witnessed in the French Wars of Religion had erupted. French Catholics had murdered tens of thousands of French Protestant Huguenots. In Massacre at Paris, Catherine de' Medici, the Catholic Queen Mother and Queen Regent of France, is considered one of the villains alongside the Catholic Duke of Guise. In history, she watched her 3 sons die as King of France, and she witnessed the French throne transition to Henry of Navarre, signaling the end of her House of Valois and the beginning of the House of Bourbon for the French throne. Now, by staging a dramatized version of the recent event, Marlowe pits tragedy against reality. The dramatized characterizations of various prominent living figures in French politics places tragic and heroic conceptions against reality. The tragic Catholic characters fashioned themselves to a conception of total Catholic domination in France, no matter what the cost. And as a result, the Duke of Guise is brutally murdered, and Catherine de' Medici must go into hiding after her plot fails. However, there is great historical irony with all of this. Massacre at Paris was Marlowe's last play. He dies on May 30th, 1593. And 2 months later, on July 25th, the now King of France, Henry IV, converts to Catholicism. The deaths of all the Catholics and Huguenots in the French Wars of Religion and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre are suddenly reduced to nothing. All the violence suddenly seems worthless. People were slaughtered like animals since they had violated all the sacred laws of humanity, and now their pain is meaningless. Their deaths have lost any tragic essence due to the arbitrariness of Henry IV changing his faith from Protestantism to Catholicism, despite him even potentially harboring Protestant beliefs inside. You see, the label of a single word in this era can determine life or death: Catholic, Protestant, witch, or Jew. And Marlowe personally experienced these consequences with his name slandered in the Baines Note, the letter that convinced Queen Elizabeth to utter his death sentence. But Faustus, Barabbas, and Guise gained their tragic power from wholeheartedly fashioning themselves to their own individual radical ambitions. But it is this radical individualism that results in their gruesome deaths. This is the tragic promise and curse of power for Marlowe's characters. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. My name is Tish Johnston, and my thesis is titled Eden Raised in the Waste Wilderness, Atonement in Milton's Paradise Regained. The first time I read Paradise Regained, I was fascinated and confused by the poem's hero. Who is this strange man? Why is he so cold and isolated from the world? This man I am talking about is, of course, Jesus, the Son of God. He is not, however, Jesus Christ. The word Christ never appears in the poem, nor does his death or crucifixion. Instead, Paradise Regained takes a handful of verses from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke about the temptation and refashions them into an extended intellectual debate between Jesus and Satan. But before I lay forth my central arguments and possibly shock members of the audience unfamiliar with Milton's theology, I will sketch a brief overview of his beliefs. Many scholars try to place a label on Milton's theology. Is it orthodox or unorthodox? If the latter, what particular type of heresy does he ascribe to? These approaches hope to find a coherent theological framework in which to examine the work of John Milton. In this project, I stand with the conclusion reached by Christopher Hill that yes, Milton's theology was unorthodox, but that it is futile to search for an exact heresy to pin him with. Milton was an eclectic who drew upon numerous thinkers and created his own ideas. Within the broad framework of theology, my thesis is specifically concerned with Milton's theory of atonement. By atonement, I mean what John Roger defines as the mechanism by which God is reconciled to fallen man, who, mired in original sin, was hitherto deserving only of the punishment of death. Therefore, by an atonement theory, I mean the particular argument for the mechanism which redeems mankind and how that redemption is brought about. This idea is closely tied to the study of salvation, also known as soteriology. Unfortunately, labeling Milton's soteriology is no easier than labeling his entire theology. There is, however, one related theme that is consistent across his poetry. The omission of the crucifixion from Paradise Regained that I alluded to earlier fits a detectable pattern throughout Milton's lifetime. John Rogers, again, describes this as quote, Milton's lifelong poetic neglect of the crucifixion and its theological implications. While the crucifixion is directly addressed in Milton's theological prose works, it is only briefly gestured towards and never directly treated in any of his poetry, including Paradise Lost. Milton's avoidance of the crucifixion in verse is symptomatic of his uncertain theory of atonement. Aware of this general trend, I have narrowed my attention to Milton's poem that explicitly addresses atonement, Paradise Regained. In traditional forensic soteriology, Jesus is a sacrificial redeemer who spilled his blood to repay mankind's debt to God and reverse the fallen Eden. But Milton chooses to exclude Jesus' violent and public death from Paradise Regained and instead offers an alternative mechanism for the redemption of mankind. My thesis approaches two questions I perceive as central to the scholarship on Paradise Regained in the last century. One, why does Milton use the temptation narrative? And two, why does Milton give this characterization of Jesus? My research has led me to conclude that while these are often treated as two separate issues, they are in fact the same question. I argue that in Paradise Regained, Jesus is a scholar who redeems mankind through his obedience and patience in the wilderness. In his opening invocation, Milton makes a bold claim to authenticity by identifying his muse as the Holy Spirit who led Jesus into the wilderness. This claim to a divine witness allows Milton to invest the temptation with a new significance and justify his departures from Scripture. If that was not enough, Milton clarifies that the true story of temptation is only now being made fully known to mankind. He calls for the Holy Spirit to tell of deeds above heroic, though in secret done, and unrecorded left through many an age, worthy to have not remained so long unsung. The word unrecorded implies that that Paradise Regained is the first true recording of these events, which the poet is now singing to the world. John Carey notes that this line is an indication that Milton believes he is telling a true account from the life of Jesus. Milton's emphasis on the authenticity and divinity of his poem in the invocation acknowledges that he puts forth a drastic shift from the gospel narrative of the temptation. And now, before launching further into the story Paradise Regained tells, I want to first illustrate a counterexample of a more traditional portrayal of the temptation. Here is a 1482 fresco by Sandro Botticelli, located in the Vatican. It depicts the temptation according to the narrative put forth in the Gospel of Matthew. In the top left-hand corner, Satan tempts Jesus to turn stones into bread. In the center, Jesus is tempted to jump from the pinnacle of the Temple of Jerusalem. And in the far right, Jesus is taken to the top of a tall mountain and offered the kingdoms of the world. In this fresco, Jesus is a performative figure. And at the end, he is depicted in clear conversation with the angels, telling them about his trial and making gestures. The most striking aspects are all of the other people in this fresco, and the Eucharist table being set on the mountain behind Christ and Satan, and the sacrificial ritual occurring in the foreground. Both of these scenes are used to foreshadow Christ's sacrifice of his body and blood in the crucifixion. So while the temptation in the wilderness is from the beginning of Christ's life, Botticelli is seemingly compelled to link it with his agony on the cross. I show this visual, sacrificial, and of course Catholic portrayal of the temptation in order to emphasize exactly what Paradise Regained changes about the narrative. Contrary to the convention in all other early modern depictions of the temptation in both art and literature, Milton does not follow the order given in Matthew, but instead adapts his structure from the Gospel of Luke, in which the Temple of Jerusalem becomes the final scene rather than the central, as in the fresco. In Paradise Regained, the temptation is an event hidden and cut off from society, where Jesus patiently and obediently undergoes attacks from Satan and remains faithful to God the Father. Mankind is wholly unaware of the event, and Jesus speaks with no character besides Satan, not even the angels who feed him at the end. Thus, I will not, and indeed cannot, show you an image of Milton's Jesus in Paradise Regained, because I believe that to do so would defeat the entire purpose of the poem. Sorry, Botticelli. The redemption of mankind is brought about by Jesus' behavior as a private individual who is dedicated to God and exhibits perfect behavior. Milton's Jesus is not a teacher or a healer or a sacrificial lamb. He is a scholar who uses evidence from Hebrew law to reject Satan and refers to figures from Scripture as models for behavior. Paradise Regained's reader is likely to assume that because Jesus is the Son of God, he inherently understands how to be patient and obedient. And the reader is not naturally inclined to question how Jesus knows to behave this way. Yet, the poem gives extensive attention to Jesus' childhood prior to the temptation, when he was focused on studying Scripture. His first speech in Paradise Regained comes in a soliloquy while he is led into the wilderness. Vocalizing his thought process as he considers the messianic mission, Jesus describes his urge from an early age to study Scripture and learn about God. When I was yet a child, no childish play to me was pleasing. All my mind was set, serious to learn and know. Going on, Jesus says, therefore above my years, the law of God I read and found it sweet, made in it whole delight, and in it grew to such perfection. Jesus' distinction between his types of study in the phrase to learn and know stresses the depth of his efforts to interpret and analyze the Word of God. Jesus credits the study of the law with raising him to perfection. Jesus believes he cultivates his virtue through scholarship. So while Jesus is naturally perfect because he is the Son of God, he gives credit to his diligent study of the law for allowing him to achieve this status. Indeed, Jesus exhibits his patience and obedience with his perfect knowledge of Scripture, using quotations from Deuteronomy to refuse Satan and repeatedly identifying Job as a model for righteous behavior. Milton's Jesus is a scholar who seeks out what is predicted about the Messiah. The reader of Paradise Regained must likewise act as a scholar by analyzing the poem to understand the information it contains about the atonement. By introducing his text as the product of divine inspiration, Milton seems to suggest that the reader should analyze Paradise Regained with exegetical diligence, the very same attention that Jesus gives to the Hebrew law. Paradise Regained, however, is not a didactic text and does not explicitly direct the reader to emulate Jesus. Instead, the process of interpretation requires the reader to follow Jesus in his scholastic path. Paradise Regained's ideal reader endeavors to apply the poem to his or her own life and use Jesus as a model to follow. Knowing the Son saved mankind through his perfect behavior, the reader is encouraged to embrace Jesus as both a redeemer and as a scriptural model. God announces in heaven that the Son's defeat of Satan will allow that all the angels and ethereal powers, they now and men hereafter may discern from what consummate virtue I have chose this perfect man, by merit called my son, to earn salvation for the sons of men. This passage embodies much of what I tried to express throughout my thesis about mankind's relationship to its own salvation. Jesus earns redemption for mankind without sacrifice through his perfect virtue. But when the temptation occurs, only the angels and ethereal powers know of the event. It is only hereafter that man may discern and understand the full story of Jesus' victory. Until that time, the event is not available for mankind to fully interpret. But this hereafter has arrived with Milton's own Paradise Regained, as it shows Jesus as the perfect, patient, and obedient Redeemer. Milton uses the temptation to represent a non-sacrificial atonement in the desert, where Jesus is dedicated to correct behavior and following God's law. And thus, mankind now has the choice to interpret or not interpret this text and understand how this strange man regained paradise.
This is me. This is it.
Before I start my presentation, I would like to extend a huge thank you to everyone who has traveled here to support our cohort, both traveling from all over the country and tuning in virtually. They do that now. I want to acknowledge the unprecedented generosity of my advisor, Professor Roland Green, who took me on as a late advisee, offered meticulous feedback, tolerated my mid-year disappearance to Oxford University, and sent me words of encouragement when I needed to hear them the most. So thank you. Thank you to Luke Barnhart, my graduate mentor, for reading numerous drafts and being my perpetual sounding board. And finally, thank you to Alice Stavely for believing in my topic, supporting my academic pursuits at every turn, and gracefully guiding all 10 of us to the finish line in one piece. I begin now with a brief anecdote about the German philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant. In 1789, he wrote the words out of wood so crooked and perverse as that which man is made of, nothing absolutely straight can ever be wrought, an attempt to visualize his views on man's moral destiny. A few years later, Kant's student, Johann Herder, wrote ideas for a philosophy of the history of mankind, noting that the erect gait of man is natural to his alone. Indeed, it is the posture proper to the whole calling of his race and also his distinguishing character. Kant, however, had an explosively angry reaction to his student's remark. In his attack of Herder's work, Kant rails against his philosophy by hatefully repeating the phrases erect gait, upright posture, erect stature, upright figure, erect carriage, upright form, 17 times in 7 pages. Critics argue that Kant's review went beyond any logical demonstration of error and was over-determined and defensive. What then triggered this uncharacteristic and seemingly uncalled for attack? A biographical detail provides a hint. Immanuel Kant had a crooked spine. Living with severe scoliosis, Kant closely resembled the crooked stick of his philosophical musings, one that could not straighten itself in the sensible world and only had a chance of doing so in the moral domain. By creating a crooked avatar for all of mankind, one that was physically representative of himself, Kant was able to eliminate the negative valence of his disfigurement by making it universal. Fiercely fighting back against Herder's philosophy, it would seem, is the physical manifestation of Kant's metaphorical struggle against a society that fails to be fully inclusive. This reading is certainly an unorthodox approach to Kant's philosophical claims. Some critics have written these types of analyses off as overly or even wrongly biographical. While it is not my intention to make historicist claims that psychoanalysis is relevant to these works, I believe that this anecdote is crucial in framing the 2 elements of my thesis at the core: the field of disability studies and the literary value of appreciating the lived experience of the hunchback. Exchanging the world of 18th century philosophy for 16th century theater, we come now to the focus of today's talk: representations of deformity in early modern drama. In my thesis, the scope of my exploration of deformity is defined as an analysis of the stigmatized collective of those who are crooked, hunchbacked, or misaligned. While Shakespeare's Richard III is certainly the most notable and nuanced dramatization of a hunchback in the 1500s, he is also one of the most frequently cited characters in the academic discipline of disability studies itself. Often described as its standard bearer, Richard III is seen as a disabled celebrity whose dominance as the King of England suggests that empowerment lies within the grasp of disabled people. As a brief overview, disability studies arose out of a growing social consciousness of injustice in the 1980s, needing a vocabulary with which to discuss the second-class citizenship of disabled individuals. Scholars began to devise critical theories and models of disability. Literary critics made it their mission to rescue the early modern disability narratives out of the critical conversation that often overlooked non-standard bodies. Others devised larger theories around literary use and misuse of disabled bodies, many of which were centered around Richard III himself. While all of these critical approaches were necessary in establishing the relatively new field as an area of unplumbed intellectual value, this critical approach has three major problems. The first is the tendency to group all disabilities together as one unrepresented identity, causing scholars to ignore the nuances of various physical and cognitive anomalies. The second is the issue of temporal difference in languages used to describe bodily variants. While disability is the politically correct catch-all term of the 21st century, it is anachronistic when used to describe deformity in the 16th century. The third issue is a continual attempt to make relevant early modern disability, wanting to generate and support theories that have the potential to illuminate the lives of those with disabilities in our modern day. The critics have left a glaring gap in the critical dialogue around the lived experiences of such people in past eras. This thesis was written in the hopes that it would eventually find itself among other second wave applications of disability studies frameworks that take these issues into account. When returning to these early modern representations of disability, I argue that we must bear in mind that it was the real experiences of those who lived with deformed bodies which inspired writers to focus on them. Before turning to the dramatizations of disfigured characters discussed in chapters 1 and 2, it is crucial to contextualize the notions of disfigurement in the early modern period. In doing so, we are able to gain a deeper understanding of Shakespeare's own interactions with the deformed, the impact that the hunchback-related stigmatization would have had on the lived Richard III's life, and the moral condemnations of deformity that the audience members would have carried with them to the theater. Starting with an overview of the social conceptions of deformity in the 16th century, the Christianization of impairment functions in the same way as the medicalization of impairment does in modern society. While the medical language of the 21st century is deeply stigmatizing in terms of its approach to labeling bodily and cognitive deviations from the norm as sickly or unwell, the stigma of sin carried deep moral condemnations of the impaired. Turning to the medical explanations of the 21st century, the hunchback is primarily caused by scoliosis, a sideways rotation of the vertebrae that gives the appearance that the person is leaning to one side. The key symptom, back pain may be present, but rarely is it significant enough to impact normal activity. Unlike other disabilities such as blindness or deafness, having a hunchback does not result in any true bodily inability. Drawing from my own experience of having lived with a severe kyphotic curve for 20 years of my life, I was not physically disabled in any way. What I did experience, however, was outside expressions of judgment and disdain for my appearance. Department store personnel commented that I would be more attractive if I stood up straighter, and college interviewers suggested that if I quit slouching, I would seem more confident. My 6th grade lab partner once turned to me and said, "You are an ugly hunchback and no one will ever love you. We clearly were not friends." These acts of stigmatization occurred even without the assumption that I was a sinful being or that I had a darkened soul, as indicated by my crooked shape. This brief foray into lived experience is meant to display that while the hunchback figure was stigmatized in the same ways as many other disabilities in the early modern period, his greatest inability is that of attraction. As much as William Shakespeare was pulling from the historical tradition when writing Richard III, subject to the influences of Tudor propaganda and dramatizing material from earlier historical accounts, he was also drawing inspiration from theatrical tradition. While limiting the scope of my thesis to focus on Richard III's deformity and hunchback nature, in Chapter 1, I attempt to construct the parameters of a multi-genre dramatic history that Shakespeare was adding to when writing King Henry VI, Part 2 and 3, in addition to Richard III. Using Stephen Greenblatt's concept of subversion and containment, introduced in his 1988 essay, Invisible Bullets, I argue that the dramatization of the Hunchback in early modern plays displays the capacity of the dominant order to generate subversion so as to use it to its own ends. Allusions to deformity and disfigurement occur in the biblical cycle play as exemplified by William Jordan's The Creation of the World, the allegorical morality play in Thomas Lupton's All for Money, and the pastoral comedy in George Peele's The Arraignment of Paris. Although they are less nuanced versions of Shakespeare's Richard III, the early modern representations of deformity briefly elevate the base hunchback figure up to the stage before returning him to the peasantry. Jordan's deformed Satan threatens the divine domain until he slinks off to hell after tempting Eve. Lupton gives a pair of hunchbacks free rein on the stage, inciting villainy and lusting after other humans, and Peele allows the crooked Vulcan to vulgarly pursue fairies before wrangling him back into place. As was the standard for the morality play, the figure of vice was meant to be enjoyed by and relatable to the audience, but his condemnation at the play's end reinforces the necessity of devout piousness. Notably, this final subversion of the hunchback figure in all three plays is enacted through an embarrassing exposition of his unfulfilling relationships and inability to woo without using corrupt methods. The simple exposition of the deformed figure's inability to attract and the accompanying desexualization is enough to definitively subvert the character. In Chapter 2, I argue that Richard is driven to embody vice due to a deep-rooted uncertainty of his self-worth. Driven by the very deep human emotions of pain and rejection, he does not know if he is truly capable of love or being loved due to his crooked shape. In the plays that precede Richard's dramatization of Richard III, the playwrights were morally untroubled by representing deformed figures of being unworthy of sexual lives and pathetically comedic if they attempted to have one. Shakespeare, however, struck by the proliferation of verbal assault endured by the hunchback figure in the early modern period, chose to dramatize this abuse. Fueled by the constant remarks that undermine his sexuality and associate his body with devilry and sin, he is driven to feel only half human. As a form of self-preservation, Richard attempts to pass as the vice character, as it is meant in the field of sociology. While this is anachronistic to the early modern period, it explains Richard's motivation for becoming that which is expected of him in order to gain social acceptance. He is treated as a non-human devil, thus he attempts to become one. In King Henry VI, Part 2, Richard's appearance is met with taunts and insults, being called a heap of wrath and a foul, indigested lump. He struggles to comprehend how and to what extent his outer shape reflects his inner self. He knows that as much as he has tried to imagine a world in which he could find a romantic partner, his father is the only person who will love him unconditionally. As the Duke of York dies on the battlefield, his son resolves to transform himself into the non-feeling, non-human vice character. In doing so, Richard is able to subsume his feelings of dubious self-worth. He claims, "Since the heavens have shaped my body so, let hell make crooked my mind to answer it. I have no brother, I am like no brother, and this word love, which graybeards call divine, be resident in men like one another, and not in me. I am myself alone." Richard summons the gods to help him meld his mind with his stigmatized form. He finds comfort in imagining a world in which the immoral compass of the body would guide him through life without doubt. Physically unlike any of his brothers, Richard denies their relation. Failing to experience romantic love, Richard denies his capacity for it. Although he knows that he is capable of experiencing love, having already done so with his father, he feels as though it is a phenomenon meant for other people. In the final line, he articulates the profoundly simple yet painful reason for his desire to embody vice. I am myself alone. As the vice-appareled Richard enters Richard III, he provides a brief synopsis of his attempt to embody evil for audience members who have failed to attend productions of King Henry VI Part 2 and Part 3. Since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, he says, I am determined to prove a villain. For the following 6 acts, Richard does just that, murdering George, Duke of Clarence, the 2 young princes of King Edward IV, and finally the Duke of Buckingham, his right-hand man. Richard becomes the evil caricature whose identity he set out to assume. Richard's ability to evade his emerging emotions, however, is not long-lasting. The night before Richmond's invasion of England, Richard is visited by a variety of impassioned ghosts. While they have come bearing insults and blessings of failure, the most harmful effect of their collective visitation is an awakening of Richard's capacity for feeling and for guilt. When he wakes up, he delivers the final monologue. Here we are. Cold, fearful drops stand on my trembling flesh. What do I fear? Myself? There's none else by. Richard loves Richard. That is, I am I. Is there a murder here? No. Yes, I am. Then fly. What, from myself? Great reason why, lest I revenge. What, myself upon myself? Alack, I love myself. Wherefore? For any good that I myself have done unto myself, oh no, alas, I rather hate myself for hateful deeds committed by myself. Throughout this speech, Richard's lived experience begins to reassociate with the vice-like alter ego that he has devised in King Henry VI Part 2. His hunchback body trembles with fear as his original anxieties about his crooked figure, inability to love, and self-worth return. Although he is utterly alone, Richard realizes that while he has deluded himself into believing that he could forego emotion by becoming vice, the human Richard has always existed. As he says, Richard loves Richard, he recognizes alarmingly that he is indeed capable of love and craves it desperately. As he becomes conscious of the abominable crimes that he has committed while acting as vice, however, Richard loses his ability for self-love as well. Wanting to fly from the person that he has become, he realizes that they are one and the same. Admitting to himself that he is human rather than the bestial devil he has attempted to embody, Richard prepares to die in a world that fails to recognize his worth as a hunchback. Having nowhere else to turn, Richard makes for the battlefield to face his impending death. Returning to the article, Shakespeare Differently Disabled, Siebers contemplates the effects of the disability studies community having appointed Richard III as its unofficial standard bearer. He asked the question, what is the price that disability scholars have paid for fitting Richard III so closely to their emerging discipline? This thesis offers that one of the most damaging consequences of this adulation of the empowered Richard is a neglect for his human vulnerabilities. Leaping at the example of a disabled person who succeeds despite his stigmatization, we idolize Richard in the hopes that he will somehow elevate the rest of the disability community as he rises to his throne. In this thesis, I have attempted to show the necessity of historical contextualization of deformity, meticulous attention to the nuance of social stigma, and a compassionate awareness of lived experience. While Richard III may always be thought of as a valiant knight in the world of disability studies, we must occasionally allow him to remove his armor and carefully attend to the wounds that social exclusion have left him with. Thank you.
I'll let everyone file in.
Well, hello. Thank you all for coming. I'm Jason Cedar, and we're going to discuss some weird things today. So I'll forewarn you. But before we begin, I'd like to thank my thesis advisor, Denise Gigante, for all her help. I'd like to thank Mark Taylor, my graduate mentor, very helpful, and Mark Algie Hewitt. I'm not sure if he's here. I doubt he is because we didn't really speak, but he seemed like a really nice guy, so I'd like to thank him for that too. And my family, because they told me that they're watching, so I hope they are. But let's begin. A woman sleeping in bed extends her long white arm towards the floor, head thrown back, locks of fair hair tumbling from her face. She is in rapture. Atop her exposed chest sits a brown demon, while in the background lurks a black horse. The demon is male. The woman, unconscious, cannot remove him, and the violence implied by her dramatic posture belies her paralysis. The scene is horrific but erotic, and it is not unlikely that the woman is experiencing an orgasm. First displayed in 1782 at the Royal Academy of London, The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli encapsulates what the 20th century literary scholar Mario Praz considered a defining characteristic of Romantic literature: an insistence on the theory of the inseparability of pleasure and pain, and on the practical side, a search for themes of tormented, contaminated beauty. Threatening supernatural forces encroach upon the attractive woman, whose elegance entices the viewer, just as her vulnerability terrifies. At the center of this masterwork sits a monster that pervades Romantic literature and art in various forms, yet has largely escaped analysis by scholars and critics: the incubus. Defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as an evil spirit that lies on persons in their sleep, especially one that has sexual intercourse with women while they are sleeping, the incubus and its female counterpart, the succubus, pervaded the imaginations of major writers and artists in the Romantic era. Granted, no prominent 19th century writer explicitly labels the monster a succubus in their poetry or stories, though the term emerged previously in the High Middle Ages. But the consistent recurrence of the figure in the Romantic canon indicates that the era's most famous writers were familiar with its depictions in medieval folklore or classical mythology. Fictional monsters are coping mechanisms. They represent, at least in part, artists' attempts to detach people's worst impulses and deficiencies, whether they be sexual, social, or intellectual, from their human origins. In creating a monster, the artist creates an inhuman vessel for his audience's repressed sentiments, through which they can recognize and confront their uncommunicated anxieties. For example, Frankenstein's monster, broadly interpreted, can be read as a reaction against scientific advancement, while Dracula embodies a conglomeration of fears, including those surrounding the threat of foreign invasion, the reversal of gender roles, and the predatory aristocracy in late Victorian England. Thoroughly examined by scholars and now canonical, these monsters typify the condensation of readership's apprehensions into popular figures that elicit both awe and condemnation. At first glance, the succubus is no different from its more iconic counterparts. Readers can readily decipher the monster as a symbol of unspoken or aberrant sexual urges, an effort by poets and artists to vilify unconscious impulses and package them in a reprehensible form. Rather than simply embodying sexual unease in the Romantic era, however, the succubus's typical appearance as an immaterial, nightmarish, and hallucinatory being separates the sleeping individual's conscious, moral self from the unconscious, instinctual creature the 19th century British public feared he could become. A fascination with sleepwalking, dreams, and drugs shows that Romantic writers did not shy away from the unconscious or disordered mind, and in fact reveled in its apparent unboundedness. But when tasked with addressing seemingly irreconcilable questions of identity and agency within sexual and moral domains, the monster becomes a useful tool for confronting fears without explicitly clarifying them. The succubus excites its victims' innermost impulses and desires, but is not itself distant or externalized, remaining a part of the self or influencing the self in ways other monsters do not. The succubus also represents a component of the unconscious, something to which the suffering victim feels joined and perhaps even assumes culpability for. As a product of the unconscious, therefore, the monster may mean something within a psychoanalytic framework. A uniquely psychological predator, one that preys on its victim while he or she is asleep, causes the victim to question his or her sexual values, or exploits unconscious fault lines in the victim's fragile identity. The succubus is particularly suited for a psychoanalytic approach. And the appearance of a psychic monster during the Romantic movement is no great surprise. Samuel Taylor Coleridge invented the term psychoanalytical in September of 1805, while the American writer Max Eastman purported in 1926 that Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, hung a copy of Fuseli's The Nightmare in his Vienna apartment. These facts may appear trivial, but they do reflect some link between British Romanticism and the early practice of psychoanalysis, as well as the centrality of the succubus to beginning conceptions of the psychoanalytic field. To further clarify this link, I will now outline the major theoretical innovations of Freud's intellectual successor, Jacques Lacan. This summary will foreground the application of the succubus as a means for understanding difficulties of representation and sexuality in two major romantic poems, Christabel by Coleridge and Lamia by John Keats. I'm sorry you guys had to look at that for so long. We can move on. Originally, I was planning to define these kind of like point by point, very technically, but they are like pretty boring, and I imagine you guys don't want to get into that. So I'll send it and go fast and loose into the poems. But anyway, applying the concepts of Jacques Lacan retroactively to the reading of a romantic monster may seem an arbitrary choice. Since Freud writes extensively on the psychosocial and sexual development of the individual, and was born near the end of the Romantic movement in 1856, his body of work might appear to be as useful for appropriation in a romantic context. Lacan is a more suitable candidate in the field of literature, however, because of his focus on language. He believed the unconscious is structured like language, and how this focus intuitively grounds the succubus as a link between symbol and abstraction, the essence of a thing not represented through language or visual signifiers. Therefore, by defining several fundamental concepts of Lacanian psychoanalysis, I predicate the argument that the succubus broadly signposts the failure of representation in two forms, namely the destructive failure of the individual's attempts to unify him or herself with the image, the ideal of perfection that the ego strives to emulate, or enter the real, the state of nature from which we have been forever severed by our entrance into language. So just bear in mind these terms as I go through the poems. I'm going to try to pronounce the French terms. I put them up here so you didn't think I was just saying something garbled and incoherent when I said them. So Christabel, I just provided a short plot summary there. Viewed from a psychoanalytic lens, Christabel is mainly a literary rendition of Lacan's conception of the mere stage, a theory that explains the formation of the ego during infancy. In his writings, Lacan adapts the definition of the ego introduced by Sigmund Freud. Freud defined the ego as that which holds in check the id, while the id is the dark, inaccessible part of our personality, or a chaos, a cauldron of seething excitations that strives to bring about the satisfaction of the instinctual needs. In forming the ego during infancy, the individual reconciles the demands of the id with the limitations of reality. But Lacan argues that the ego is an imperfect construction. When the infant recognizes his image in a mirror, he believes he can achieve mastery over his form. Though he struggles to coordinate the physical movements of his body, seeing himself in his totality for the first time suggests that he may later control his body and mind in tandem, establishing coherence and unity over the self. But any sense of unity is an illusion. The subject can never achieve the totality implied by the image because the image is literally outside the self. It is a source of confidence, but also one of alienation that asserts the fragmentation of the ego. The subject is always in conflict with its image because though the image ensures that the individual exists, it also guarantees that the individual will only be understood in terms of how others understand the image. This is the primary limitation of Lacan's imaginary order. The subject is beholden to the image, and the ego's control over the subject's identity and the id is essentially an illusion, as I mentioned. In Christabel, one can read Geraldine, who is standing, to some extent as the mirror image of Christabel, who is reclining sumptuously on the bed, the poem's noble heroine. In an allegorical reading of the poem, Christabel is the subject, who feels drawn to Geraldine because she wants to join herself to the image and resolve the fragmentation that separates her identity, her ego, from herself. She is unable to do so, however. As a subject, Christabel is passive, while the image, Geraldine, is capable of exerting control over Christabel and disturbing her social frameworks, i.e. her nobility, her love for an absent knight, and her relationship to both her mother and her father. These frameworks constitute Christabel's ego, while her defilement due to Geraldine's unchecked sexual aggression exemplifies the failure of the ego to contain the id. I believe I mentioned, and there is a point at which Geraldine seduces Christabel in the poem, and she does so by revealing a mark. The revelation of the mark is the narrative crux of Christabel. The mark that Geraldine reveals is not explained or described, and the monster's incapacity to be defined by normal modes of linguistic representation, underscoring that incapacity. Just when the succubus's physical form causes the most distress for the victim, a quasi-orgasmic moment occurs in which the narrator depicts Geraldine as detached from her surroundings, adopting a stricken look, as if deep from within she seems halfway to lift some weight with sick assay. The narrator goes on to proclaim that Geraldine's bosom and half her side are a sight to dream of, not to tell. He neglects to communicate the immediate consequences of Christabel's encounter with the monster. But in the context of the mirror stage, the moment also evokes a dreadful instance of misrecognition when the subject, Christabel, realizes she cannot embody and eliminate her rival image. Instead, this image permeates Christabel's life, upending the ego and casting doubt on the security of her identity and relationships with other people, including her mother and her father. And yeah, as I mentioned in the summary, Geraldine hits on her father and weird Oedipine stuff. It's all about that. Moving on. Lamia. This is a early 20th century painting, which kind of, in the poem, Lamia is actually like a woman-serpent hybrid. She's not as pretty as that, but she transforms into a woman. And Lycius, the beloved, is a scholar, not a knight. But this is the best I could do, right? Read in a Lacanian context, Lamia by John Keats is a fantastical examination of the individual's encounter with the objet petit a and her unsuccessful attempt to quell the drive, the individual's overpowering attraction towards the real. The real is the bare fact of existence as such that defies symbolization. The only way to satisfy the drive is by exiting the symbolic framework and entering the real. And the best way to approach the real is by reaching towards the objet petit a, which is a kernel of the real that is encapsulated within a symbolic container. Lycius, the Corinthian scholar, with whom the monster Lamia falls in love, is for Lamia the container of the objet petit a, which varies by individual. Lamia's passionate yearning for him reflects her drive towards the real, but her death indicates the impossibility of sating the drive. Her experience of jouissance, which is a feeling I'd find as of mixed sensation of pleasure and pain that constitutes disappointment before and after the individual realizes her drive will not be fulfilled, though the feeling occurs most frequently after a sexual encounter. What typically sustains the individual upon feeling jouissance and realizing her place within the symbolic order is fantasy, the realm in which an individual might bend social and physical rules. Lamia, a snake-like monster, is a fantastic creature. A figure of Greek mythology, she's capable of shape-shifting and traveling via dream to many spectacular locations in the landscape of Greek mythology. Where she willed, her spirit went, whether to faint Elysium or where god Bacchus drains his cups divine. These abilities, particularly her ability to transgress the boundaries between mental and physical spaces, suggest she is a succubus who belongs within a fantastic context. But Lamia kills herself by undoing her role in a mythical world. She begs the god Hermes to change her into a woman so she can love Lycius. But before Lamia and Lycius marry, the young man's teacher, Apollonius, dispatches Lamia by exposing her as a monster. Apollonius is thus the antagonist of the poem, but Lamia, in transforming into a woman to leave a fantastic domain, ensures her own demise. Like the ego, a fantasy is a fragile construct, and though it is necessary for preserving the individual in the face of the overwhelming limitations of symbol, death remains the only outcome for an individual who attempts to subvert these limitations by grasping at the objet petit a. Lamia could never be happy in accepting the symbolic labels attached to her. She hates being a monster, but even after she becomes a beautiful young woman and seduces Lycius, she feels sorrow once Lycius demands they marry. Their relationship hinges tenuously on the compatibility of fantasy and reality, but Lamia's misery within the symbolic order concludes with her dissolution into nothingness, and which leads to the poem's dramatic conclusion. Apollonius, staring at Lamia from across the wedding table, paralyzes her. Her blood stops flowing. The narrator perceives that now no azure vein wandered on fair spaced temples, and he adds, Lamia, no longer fair, there sat a deadly white. Accusing the succubus of being an illusion, Apollonius cries, Begone, foul dream. And despite Lycaeus' panicked assertion that Apollonius himself is the monster, Marcal, possessed, his lashless eyelids stretch around his demon eyes. The wise man will not be stopped. He brushes away the protests of Lycaeus, denounces Lamia, and exposes her for what she truly is, yelling, "A serpent." Lamia is now deprived of her flimsy role within human society, and since she is already detached from the landscape, where she could avoid the touch of cold philosophy, the narrator declares that she emits a frightful scream and vanished. And not long after Lamia's death, the narrator bluntly shares that her partner, Lycaeus, loses the life in his limbs before his pulse and breathing cease. Finally, it seems, Lamia has broken free of the bonds of representation. She is nothing. But this nothingness comes at the cost of her life and that of the beloved object, the scholar who had lured her from the protections of fantasy. Perhaps the destruction of Lamia and Lycaeus shows that reason and fantasy are not only incompatible, but mutually inimical. So in short, my thesis argues that there is an elemental division within the individual, that harrowing gap between who one is and who the symbolic order permits him to be. And it is the succubus at the edge of the bed who pries at this division and quietly oversees man's writhing discontent. Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jack. I'll be presenting my thesis that I call Working Within the Trap, Resistance and Representations of Race and Gender in Baldwin and Kadzea. Before I get started, I want to thank the people who supported me. It's hard to thank them all by name, but I, of course, want to mention my advisor, Terry Castle, my secondary reader, Jose David Salivar, Xander Manchel, my grad advisor, and everybody else who was so patient with me these last few months, and the people we hear. It means so much to me to see you in the audience. Thank you. So my thesis explores what are clearly two very different works of literature. The first is a collection of essays written by an American author living in Paris in 1955. This is Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. And the other work is a novel called Disgrace, written by the South African writer J.M. Kadzea in his home country of South Africa in 1999. And while any of the historicists that Dan brought up will warn us about interpreting works written in such different places in the same context, each of these books shares an assumption that forms the foundation of my thesis and indeed much of my thought. This assumption is the supremacy of unreality. Both works acknowledge the powerful and dangerous consequences of things that do not exist. So before diving back into these two works, I want to share how I came to be able to view them eye to eye, to share this assumption and to understand them. What I suppose I'm offering is an intellectual journey, and I will start, as is appropriate, in the middle. Earlier this year, struggling to write this thesis, I sat in a room that was literally papered with false starts. And I shuffled through papers, and I found in an index card something I had written early in the fall. And this index card read, "I am interested in what is real and the important things that are not." This thesis presents a culmination of that later interest, the things that are unreal and are so important. So much of my education has evacuated of reality things that have such importance in our lives. They've revealed to me the unreality of things like nationality or linear time and progress. That's Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. But while these massive concepts have been evacuated of reality, the two most powerful constructs that have fell to the dissolving notion of social construct have, of course, been race and gender. In years spent both in the library and the picket line, I had become convinced that both race and gender come not from our unmediated perception of reality, but rather the necessities of power. In other words, race and gender were never discovered, they were made. Of these two immense constructs, race was the first to reveal its artifice in the work of writers like James Baldwin, as well as Aníbal Quijano, Walter Mignolo, Stuart Hall, Enrique Dussel, and Michel Foucault. I found forceful and exhaustive demonstrations that our racial classifications and our perceptions of racial hierarchies do not have their origins in our observations of human difference, but rather in Europeans' attempts to justify their subjugation of much of the world. Categories and racial classifications like blackness were created by Europeans to justify and rationalize nothing short of slavery, and later, intense and ongoing discrimination. The reality of gender fell for me not long after, in the work of feminist thinkers like Judith Butler, Angela Davis, Simone de Beauvoir, Bell Hooks, and Shulamith Firestone. I found that concepts of gender were not discovered, but rather progressively created in order to enforce heteropatriarchal gender norms. As I saw illuminated most clearly in Beauvoir and Butler, gendered concepts like femininity function as myths that necessitate and coerce certain practices out of those assigned those labels. Following Butler's theory of performance and de Beauvoir's insistence that one is not born, but rather becomes woman, I came to understand both gender and race as concepts that are closer to verbs than they are to nouns, which is to say, processes that we participate in rather than identities that inhabit us. For me, like many others, the question that came after recognizing race as something we do and gender as something we do was, why can't we stop? If we recognize that this system of categorization and classification creates hierarchies that are not natural or inherent to us, why do we insist on continuing our participation in these processes? We do race, we do gender. Why can't we stop? In the years that the country witnessed the murder of Tamir Rice at 12 years old and Michael Brown at 18 years old, this question has proved easy for me to answer. Race and gender do not exist purely as ephemera. Just as the border between nations is an imaginary line that then is reinforced with barbed wire and walls and people with guns. Police violence, mobs, and the threat of power on our bodies enforces the definitions and the borders between our concepts of gender and our concepts of race. As theorists in both the fields of ethnic and feminist studies acknowledge, race and gender are undergirded by the material realities of our societies. However, my work has never been that of a sociologist, and my object of study is not directly society, but rather literature. And as I set out to engage in this project, I had the hope that our literature, free from the material constraints of our society, could offer us ways to stop doing race and stop doing gender, or at least do them in a different way. I had this notion that brute power doesn't make its way into the pages of our novels. It's free from the police and the threat of the mob. Or so it would seem. As I worked to find ways that our literature could move out of these constructs and out of these regimes of race and gender, I had the unnerving sensation of walls beginning to close in on me. In our literature, a place that seems purely discursive and conceptual, I still found rock-solid boundaries preventing me and other authors from moving outside of race and gender. My question then became, what stops our literature from deferring participation in these constructed regimes? How can authors write about racialized and gendered bodies in ways that do not reify, which is to make the abstract real, does not reify the social constructs of race and gender? Is there any way we can portray human beings outside of what Baldwin calls their categorization, their category of race, their category of gender? And this gets me to the second thing that binds the two works I looked at, as well as many of the theorists I engaged with. Pessimism. The answer is dour. We can't. The authors I engage with argue that writers, like all people in society, have little, if any, volition in the ways that they take part in the epistemic regimes of race and gender. It's a difficult point to understand, but I began to understand it in Baldwin, where he writes about the nature of categorization. And he says that we find ourselves bound, first without, then from within, by the nature of our categorization. We take our shape, it is true, within and against the cage of reality bequeathed to us at birth. And yet it's precisely through our dependence on this reality that we are most endlessly betrayed. Society is held together by our need, We bind it together with legend, myth, coercion, fearing that without it, we will be hurled into the void, within which, like earth before the word was spoken, the foundations of society are hidden. Baldwin here expresses something similar to what Lacan tries to express when he discusses the distinction between the real and our meaningful experience of that real, of that thing that we imagine is actually there. Baldwin explicit that legend, myth, and coercion are necessities in our experience of the world. While Lacan opts for a psychoanalytic analysis and Baldwin offers metaphor, in Kadzia's novel, we find a character trying to contort romantic imagery and an interpretation of the Romantic poet William Wordsworth to understand this distinction between his meaningful experience of the world and what he imagines is actually there. I won't bore you with a very long, close reading, but one of the most interesting parts of this lecture is when this professor says, living thought, the great archetypes, pure ideas find themselves usurped by mere sense images. When we read these two things together, these two quotes together, we find that the best metaphor for understanding the distinction between our experience of the world, our meaningful experience of the world and the world that's actually there, is language. I think language is the best metaphor, or perhaps even metonym, to describe what's going on here. Our words and our systems of constructing sentences rely on meanings that precede us, meanings that were created before we were born and will exist long after we leave. To make sense, we need to understand, our ability to make sense entirely relies on these systems of meaning that do not have their origin in ourselves. And when we put this into a broader context of race and gender and understand them as concepts of language, we can start using the metaphor of words to explain the impossibility of moving beyond race, the impossibility of post-race or post-gender. And I think the easiest way to do this is through simple analogy, that when we look at these words, they're just marks on a screen or marks on a paper, but it is impossible for us not to read them. And the proof of that is pick any word here and look at it and try not to read it. My intimation here is that the same process happens when you look at my body. You will look at me, I'm just a body standing in this room, but it is impossible that you will not start trying to read my race. It is impossible that you will not start trying to read my gender. Subconsciously, you will start trying to interpret me through these constructs, through these meanings, what Baldwin calls categories, that precede us. What stops us from abandoning these categories is that fact that it becomes part of our common sense, that our understanding of the world and each other, our image of ourselves in the mirror and the people in front of us, rely on these categories, rely on these systems of meaning. And without them, we will fall into a space of meaninglessness that Baldwin calls the void. Judith Butler perhaps explains this best in when she corrects a bad reading of gender trouble. She says, even once we recognize gender as something that's constructed, as something that's a fiction, that doesn't imply that we have any sort of volition in the way we take place in this regime of gender. She says that the very formation of subjects, the very formation of persons supposes gender and, let's say, race in a certain way. She goes on to explain that when we talk of gender performance, we're not talking about something like choice, but rather the repetition of oppressive and painful norms as we force them to re-signify. Her conclusion here is grim. This is not freedom, but the question of how to work within the trap that one is inevitably in. As you can see, this thesis on Baldwin and Kadzia spends most of its time exploring this trap, the epistemic and linguistic chains that detain even the most progressive writers and thinkers. At its heart, the nature of the trap is that race and gender underpin our common sense. They make possible our modes of communication. And just as our language depends on socially derived meanings, our understanding of ourselves and others requires the constructs of race and gender, which themselves derive from social practices. And as we know, social practices are always determined by the necessities of power. Thus, creating literature without or outside of the representations and stereotypes available to us would be akin to writing books without words. It would be to acquiesce to a complete breakdown in sense and admit the fundamentally unknown into both our literature and our thought. This is the next thing that unites Baldwin and Kadzia's work. Their shared acceptance of what Butler assumes is intolerable, a complete breakdown in sense, and an acquiescence to the unknown. Recognizing that the constructs of race and gender derive their power from our dependence on them to make meaning, Baldwin and Coetzee's work both advocate that we relinquish our attachment to that meaning. Both authors ask us to accept and propagate a collapsing center of sense and reason. I begin with Baldwin. In my first chapter, I explore his attack on protest novels. In his attack on these novels, he extols authors like Richard Wright and Harriet Beecher Stowe to abandon categories like race that society offers us to understand people. Though he recognizes that we depend on the nature of categorization to avoid falling into what he calls the void of meaninglessness, Baldwin declares that this meaninglessness, this void, this vagueness and confusion are fundamental aspects of what it means to be human. To accept what he calls the disquieting complexity of ourselves, he proclaims that we must relinquish our affinity for a neatly ordered, understandable world, and instead locate what is real about ourselves in paradox, darkness, and danger. He says it is only within this web of ambiguity, paradox, this hunger, danger, darkness, can we find at once ourselves and the power to free us from ourselves. Of course, the extreme instability which comes with that freedom is not negligible. As Baldwin readily admits, what waits us outside of our system of categorization is nothing less than chaos. In his novel Disgrace, J.M. Coetzee explores the psychological shockwaves that rock through an individual's center of meaning when that meaning collapses and when the individual loses his ability to classify and understand other people. The context in which Coetzee is able to write this book gets me to yet another similarity between Notes of a Native Son and Disgrace. These two books are not just bound by their philosophical notions, but always historicist realities. This, of course, should not be surprising because the relationship between a text's historical context and the philosophical notions it's able to express is always a direct relationship. Baldwin and Coetzee both wrote their books in the midst of what we can call a great transformation in their home countries, the end of de jure segregation in the United States and the end of apartheid in South Africa, respectively. In these times, the meanings of both race and gender collapsed through their foundations as they were debated and contested in the battleground of politics. As regime changed and the center of social meanings crumbled, Baldwin and Coetzee could both recognize the artifice and fundamental instability of the categories and archetypes that organize their respective societies. This historical recognition of race and gender's conceptual volatility inaugurates the possibility of both Notes of a Native Son and Disgrace. Coetzee's novel Disgrace, written in 1999, explores the psychological ramifications of the Great Transformation, the end of apartheid, by offering insight into the interior life of David Lurie, an aging white professor in Cape Town, South Africa. Disgrace explores how Lurie, a white man, reacts when his ability to make meaning of the world begins to break down, when his ability to classify and categorize other people fails him, and the other person becomes entirely foreign and unknown. In the novel's exploration and portrayal of violence and its after effects, Coetzee asks us what our ethics and civil society could look like and how they could maintain themselves when we abandon Baldwinian categories, when we abandon the semiotics that lets us recognize and classify other people. Disgrace asks how our ethics can persist when we cannot construe the other person as an object of knowledge. The question, in other words, is how do we know how to treat people when we admit that we fundamentally cannot understand who or what they are? Just as Baldwin extols us to acknowledge ambiguity as a fundamental aspect of our understanding of ourselves, Coetzee asks us to acknowledge the unknown as the most important part of our experience of other people, or the other. When we look at or conceive this other person, so much of who they are remains entirely and inherently unknown to us. In her criticism of Disgrace, the critic Gayatri Spivak connects Coetzee's respect for the unknown to the philosophy of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. Paraphrasing the Jewish intellectual, Spivak writes that the eruption of the ethical interrupts and postpones the epistemological, the undertaking to construct the other as an object of knowledge, an undertaking which is always unfinished. Disgrace implicitly declares that we do not need to represent or comprehend other people in order to know how to treat them, as the ethical will always proceed in that job of trying to understand the other. Coetzee's novel works to destabilize the representation of the other and instead turns to that which lies outside of our knowledge, which is our bodies. In many ways, Kazuya's novel inaugurates what I call a return to body. In his exploration of Luri's consciousness, Kazuya reveals that we maintain a sensual, corporal experience of the world that exists outside of our categorization. What's outside of our living thought is what he calls the soulless image of the world. We still have an experience of our sense data. Our bodies still have an experience of the world. While the sense data might remain entirely incomprehensible without our systems of meaning, it nonetheless indicates that there's a real world outside of our knowledge and discourse. Much of Kazuya's novel works to indicate this gap between our thought and the world, which is also the gap between our conception of the other and the person that is actually there. The final and central question I take up in regards to Kazuya's novel is how we might be able to represent bodies in literature as simply bodies, devoid of the epistemic regimes like race and gender. I answered this question by close reading a pivotal scene in which Luri's daughter Lucy renounces her claims to land, property, and even dignity, and declares that she wants to start from nothing, like a dog. My second chapter is largely an exploration of the possibility and ramifications of this dog life. What would it mean to live a life outside of the abstractions that govern human relations? If Lucy's radical actions to start from nothing is at all possible, perhaps our literature can also start from nothing in its portrayal of the non-human subject. Lucy's choice of words, life like a dog, to live like a dog, is important, because in his mediation on the non-human, namely dogs, Kazuya offers us the opportunity to ask what our literature and ethics could look like if we abandoned that final, very immense construct, the human, and instead turned our thought and our representation to body itself. The novel gives us a chance to imagine what it would be like to postpone the task of representing bodies and instead simply acknowledge the other body's capacity to suffer. Kazuya offers us this opportunity through his mediation on the lives of dogs. In various scenes, Kazuya portrays the suffering of the non-human as very similar to the experience of our own human suffering. These portrayals of non-human suffering remind us that we do not suffer in representations of our bodies, or the human representation of our bodies, but rather our bodies themselves. The novel shows the fact that the fact that bodies have a capacity to suffer is the only relevant ethically relevant epistemology that we need to acknowledge. I originally intended to have a third chapter that was a bit more hopeful, that escaped the pessimism and really showed distinct methods of how we can work within the trap. But I ran out of both time and space. And maybe I think in the last 4 years I've developed maybe too much of an affinity for pessimism. But I do want to end today's talk on some of the discrete ways that we might be able to think within the trap, what I call cage thinking. And the three most productive areas that I've found in my studies have been border thinking, queering, and decolonization. Border thinking is epitomized by Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa. To give a very brief and abstract summary that does it no justice, Anzaldúa explores Chicanidad, which is the identity and experience of being Chicano, which she describes both in metaphor and in analogy as the border between the United States and America. When we engage in border thinking, we can move outside of hegemonic categories like race and gender the same way that we can move outside of hegemonic regions like countries. She says in her book that she is not American and she's not Mexican, and she's not both and she's not neither, but the reality of who she is lies somewhere in between or outside of these major categories. You can see how border thinking could provide us a way to think within the trap, to not abandon these categories, but still not find ourselves entirely subsumed by them. And the next possible methodology is queering, which Butler explores at the end of Gender Trouble. She says that we can use discursive practices. She uses drag as an example, drag performance as an example, to challenge and reveal the artifice of our performances of race and of gender. This also allows us to start thinking about things like gender in a spectrum. And I'd be interested in talking about the possibility of thinking of race as something also as a spectrum. And the last notion is decolonization, which is expressed in the work of thinkers like Anabel Quijano and Walter Mignolo. which I think is best summed up in a phrase that is a motto for the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico, which is that they are trying to create a world where multiple worlds fit. Decolonization means returning to the indigenous practices that existed before European colonialization, and those practices include systems of categorization, systems that we might call race and gender but are very distinct. And by acknowledging that race and gender can be done in very different, radically different ways than we do it from our European understanding, we can start revealing their artifice and perhaps move within them. Still, I remain pretty pessimistic. But anyway, thank you all for your help today.
Thank you all for incredibly intellectually engaging and complex papers. And I want to open up to questions, and I wanted to just, as a segue to from Jack's talk, to get us thinking about how much the rigorous intellectual work that's been engaged by these students will go on and on. I think he's giving you that really vital sense that these aren't ideas that these students just are checking off on boxes and they're going to get their degree and then they're going to head off into the world and forget it all. I think it's a testament to your intellectual vitality and on ongoing intervention in all of your fields. So with that thought, I will open it up to questions. I hope there are some. Yes, one. You want to go over? Oh, I'll put that back. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks again. That was really wonderful and really thoughtful presentations of clearly much more complex works for everybody. I was struck by two things: the kind of overlap or a lot of links between themes, that there's a lot of you are interested in power and ambition, desire. The papers are clearly linked that way, and yet there was so much diversity in kind of methodology, where we had network analysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis and historicism and a kind of transhistorical ideological critique. And this is a speculative question for whichever of you finds it interesting. I was kind of wondering if you could either add a chapter to your work or revise your chapter using the methodology of one of your peers. Do you think it would qualify or add, or what do you think would happen? And it's a really speculative question, sorry. What's the next chapter?
Yeah, I think maybe not even a chapter, but like another whole nother thesis on the same subject could come from a Lacanian take on race and gender. A large part of my thesis comes from what Foucault and Butler described as subject formation, how power forms what we call ourselves, what we call our subjectivity, how power can form that. And Lacan has some very interesting work on what he calls the possibility of self as the inmixing of otherness. And I'd be really interested in looking at the psychoanalytic mechanisms of which power slips inside of us, because I've looked at how that works in literature, but I'd really like to look at it from a psychoanalytic or even clinical psychological framework. And so I think Lacan is the first step into that, the rabbit hole that I could fall down and spend a lot of time in.
Yeah, your question reminds me of a really sort of like apt quote from Terry Eagleton's work, aptly called William Shakespeare, where he says, Shakespeare, no matter, I'm referencing Hamlet, I believe, it seems that the works of Nietzsche and Freud and Heidegger and all of these very influential cultural theorists and philosophers appear to permeate the work as we read it in the modern age. So I think that where the next chapter goes is really deeply personal in terms of what me as an individual or what each of us as individuals are piqued in our interest of. So whether that's doing some psychoanalysis or going back and expanding on sort of all these different modes of new historicism and all these different modes of cultural materialism, that for me, I mean, my dream third chapter would just be, what is tragedy and what is just raw patheticism, the difference between the two, which is what I found very, very exciting at the end of my thesis.
I think the hunchback topic could use some text analysis. I think you could do so much. And the project also came from this summer just finding all of these early modern hunchbacks and going through. I found 16, 32. Some were questioned, are they just deformedly ugly, or are they actually deformed? You have to draw a line and start fishing out who these people. But the rhetoric of insults, I think, and what that betrays your inner anxieties on what you choose to pick on other people, I think would be a very interesting addition. So yeah. Any other questions?
I have a magical thinking question, which is inspired by Greenblatt's opening in Shakespearean Negotiations, where he says that he's always wanted to talk to the dead, and bringing back bodies. So if your authors could come back, not as ghosts but as embodied entities, what would you like to ask them? Read my thesis. You don't want to talk to them.
What's it like in the 1800s? What do you do? Oh my God.
More profound.
Oh, yeah, here you want to talk about that.
I think for John Milton, I would be curious as to what he would choose as his favorite work of poetry that he wrote. And I think we know that, a little bit, that Paradise Regained didn't get a very popular reception, and Milton was sort of like, well, why not? It's great, and thought pretty highly of himself. But I think, especially as far as what is representative of his religious beliefs, because there are contradictions with, the Christian doctrine and with his poetry. And so what's his favorite? What does he like? What is he even, to say, most proud of it? And is it Paradise Lost? I don't know. That's certainly what modern scholars think of. That's what they like most. Yeah.
I would love to ask Shakespeare, did he know that King Richard III was a hunchback? We found his body. We know in 2013 it was in a Leicester parking lot that he did have severe scoliosis. But I want to, what was his surety level? Was he 80% sure? Would that influence his work? Anyway, that's it.
Well, John Keats died super young. So I guess I would ask him, what more do you want? What more would you want to do? Yeah, now that you're alive. And with Coleridge, Christabel is a fragment, so we never finished it. So how would you want to finish it? Just very simple questions. But.
One of my authors, Jem Kadzia, is still alive, but I've heard he's such a misanthropist. I'm not sure I'd want to spend too much time in a conversation with him. I think I'd really love if Baldwin died in 1986, and I think that if he was alive today, there are so many questions I'd want to ask him, and I think so many of the questions we're asking now were answered by Baldwin in 1955 and 1962. I think that his books are so relevant to us today. But I think what kind of shot up in popularity and then shot down in popularity within ethnic studies and generally a lot of humanities in the last decade was the idea of post-race, is that if our telos here is our goal here to completely abandon doing race. Baldwin seemed interested. He changed his language between 1955 and 1980 and he stopped using terms like white people and instead said the people who need to think of themselves as white. And I'm wondering if his telos was a complete abandonment of race, or if he had some attachment, if he saw some usefulness or I think what a lot of us find is a deep, almost spiritual meaning in these racial classifications, an ability to express ourselves. And I'm wondering if Baldwin would advocate for us completely abandoning them or finding a way, kind of how I suggest, work within the trap, not eschew them or lose them, but find a way to work with them in a way that doesn't totally entrap us.
And real quick, I would ask Marlo 2 questions. The first one relating to his time period, in that is fear and dissent really a sentiment harbored within individuals, that the common individual? And the second one I'd ask him is, if he took a look at where we are in the heart of Silicon Valley, if he sees any similarities with the rise, with the explosive rise of Elizabethan drama in the theater scene, and the explosive rise of sort of the tech startup scene that we see in Silicon Valley. Because I think I might be surprised if he sees some commonalities in terms of the reaction to it. Yeah.
Crazy conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask one quick question of Jack? I'm very sorry to have been teaching and missing the previous attractions, but they sound interesting and wonderful. Jack, I just have a question for you. What happened to the biological?
Yeah. Yeah, that's I think I even said this to you explicitly once, Terry, that I'm like, I'm gonna have some presumptions or some a priori assumptions in my thesis that I'm sure you'll have problems with, but you can take them up with Judith Butler, or take them up with James Baldwin. Yeah, I think it, like, that's essentially inaugurates like all the work I'm going to be doing in potential graduate work, or just generally like my scholarly work going onwards, is trying to understand the relationship between these representations in our bodies. And part of understanding that relationship is how much of the origin of our social practices comes from biological realities. The fact that there is difference between bodies. We look different, and our bodies have different anatomy. And how much of the differences that we then construe on our society, how much is that based in those biological differences? I think in the beginning of my talk, I described how my job is that of the literary theorist and not the sociologist, and I look at texts and not society. Obviously, I kind of cheated in my thesis and looked at both, but I think maybe I'll use that as a halfway excuse for why I didn't spend too much time mediating on biological essentialism or the role of biology in these categories, that what Baldwin calls categories. But that definitely could be a whole nother thesis. That could be. I mean, that could be.
At one point, you said gender derives from society or social attitudes.
Yeah, I think.
And that's it?
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's again a question that maybe, or like my presumption is something that I stated maybe overly strong than to my own beliefs. It was useful to think this way for my thesis, and is useful to think this way, but like when I read a work like Gender Trouble, I think that question, that relationship between, I think so much of how we do gender, like dresses aren't part of biology, right? Or makeup's not part of biology, but what's the relationship between these performances and the actual kind of biological or hormonal or physical tendencies, with the substrate? And that's a relationship that I think that, my fourth year undergraduate assumption here, or tentative guess here, is that biology plays a large role, but it's maybe outcompeted by the societal. I think that they vie for our practice. And I think that I'm still trying to figure out the relationship, but I think that it's worth talking about gender as a social practice and race as a social practice. That's just as useful as talking about them as biological realities. I'll come to your office hours and we can talk about this more.
Any final words? Well, on that note, I want to thank you all again for your extraordinary work this year, and I've been thrilled to work with all of you and watch you grow and write such extraordinary theses over the last 12 months it's been. And thank you all for coming, and the advisors always for pushing our students and getting them to create the best of themselves on paper and in person. So we wish them well. They're all going off into adventurous careers in graduate school, business, consulting, internships, publishing, Fulbright, all kinds of adventures await them, and we have been privileged to teach them. So thank you, and that's it for this year.